Recently, I've been frustrated at the level of knowledge that I'm retaining after reading books. And I've been reading a lot of books and spending a lot of time reading, and then finding that some things really stick, but so much of what I read is not sticking. And so I went back and reviewed some books and materials I'd read in the past on memory and improving retention of what you read. And it really came back to two principles that I'd learned and then forgotten to apply or thought that I didn't need to. And that's that making completely new memories unrelated to anything that you already know is very energy intensive. And that memory is about making connections between things. And so if you can connect what you are reading, the new material, to what you already remember, and maybe what you remember well, then that's going to be most effective. And certainly that note-taking is incredibly important and is part of this process. And so in practical terms, what this means is that lately, when I read a book, I'm only going to read if I will make the time and space to sit down and write notes as I go, summarizing, making connections, and then to review those notes. So I was essentially reading and feeling like I was learning, when it turns out that that's more of a trick of working memory, where you read and you really feel like you have it down very clearly in your mind, and you move on, and then you haven't really retained it because you have not transferred it to long-term memory. So I feel like I've been tricked by this for quite some time. Somewhat separately, a colleague of mine introduced me to the idea that when he was at school, they wrote their own textbooks. It was a Montessori style school. And the idea that you would write your own textbook at school at first seemed incredibly strange, but then within moments, it actually seemed like the best possible thing you could do at school. If you imagine a student compiling their own text on, say, they're learning beginning calculus. If you imagine that you would try to write your own textbook, you don't know, instantly you have questions. And that's another thing that I've been reading about in terms of memory, that a great thing you can do when reading a book is to actually start by skipping ahead to the questions, try and answer them, or go through the material, skim through and write your own questions about the material. And this will set up hooks in your mind. Essentially, when you read through, the material can then go onto that hook, into that slot. You've made space for it, and then your mind has a way to sort it already. And just briefly reading about this concept of writing your own textbook, some of the benefits were highlighted as being the fact that it's active learning, very active learning. Students have to engage deeply with the material to actually be able to write their own notes, their own textbook that a teacher is going to be checking. And so it needs to all be correct, but then it's going to be in their own words, their own structure. And they'll otherwise be learning research skills. They don't know how one aspect works. They need to go and find out and incorporate it into their own notes. Critical thinking, creativity, collaboration as they work with other students to work out something, some parts of integration or partial derivatives, and then they collectively make notes, but ultimately need to make their own. And then later, if you were to go back and review, my experience has always been that it's a lot easier to review my own notes than to go back to a textbook from which the notes were derived, because I have structured them the way that I prefer. And then finally, the sense of ownership of the textbook and also the material to some extent. And in hearing this, then I realized that I had actually done this once before, many years ago now, but I was at the time learning how to build iOS applications in Ruby using RubyMotion, which I think has a new name now. And Core Data is this API in iOS for storing data in a structured manner. And there was no material available at the time, or very little, in how you'd use Core Data with RubyMotion. And so I started making notes, and it quickly turned into, just by the way I was structuring it, it was starting to look like a book. And LeanPub, I think, might have been fairly new at the time. So I decided to give it a go. And the result was this book, which goes into a lot of detail and shows how you can use it in practice. And so this was quite popular. I let it be free, or you could drag the slider down so people could just have the book. So there were mostly free downloads, but also people paying, which I took as appreciation for the work that had been put in. And also it was just fun to make something, release something, and I quite liked this style. And so recently I am studying the transformer architecture in machine learning, and particularly how to use it in practice in terms of fine-tuning existing base models and the different problems that you can solve. And so that's what this is. So I've started this process again, which came about because I was writing notes in Markdown for my own use, and it started again to take on the structure of a book. And so I'm also going to write a bit about some thoughts on how to study the material, because this is my way of trying to really retain this knowledge by actually writing up chapters on these different parts of the material. So I'm thinking of making a video soon on the difference between encoder-decoder models, decoder only, and sequence to sequence. And so this is essentially my preparation for that. And then on a practical basis, how do you use the pipelines in Hugging Face? And then how does it work? What is the pipeline doing for you? And then some more empty sections. I haven't done these yet, but these are the kinds of things that I want to write about. And then in terms of this book, one thing I want to do is keep it really practical about just solving practical problems, but then also link to background material if you want to dig into what certain terms mean, and then also just experimenting with the slightly broken maths notation here, but just working that out. Because I think that that's what I prefer. I'm motivated by solving problems. I'm less motivated by just learning theory for the sake of learning it. But I also do like to understand on a deeper level the theory. So I'm going to try and explore that in the background material, keep the rest of the book really practical. And then the manuscript itself is going to be public. So if anybody had a question or a correction for the material, then I would absolutely welcome all interaction there. And also in comments below, anything that you find particularly confusing about transformers, or just any questions at all, then I would love to engage with you on this. And just to give a sense of how easy this setup is, if you're thinking about doing something similar, if you have your repository in GitHub, and it can be private, if you just change the .com to .dev, then you get a web version of VS Code where it's possible to install extensions as well. So I'm actually able to use Vim bindings as I normally would. And this means that no matter what machine I'm on, as long as I can sign into GitHub, then I can be writing my notes. I can version control them, and that's going to make it easier to incorporate any feedback from you or anyone, and to also keep track for others if they want to use the material, to see what has changed. And so, yeah, the goal here is to become fluent in this material and then hopefully also help others who like this approach of taking a more code-first approach when it comes to the application of transformer models to practical problems. Going to start with natural language processing problems like classification of whole sentences, like the overall sentiment of a bit of text. Is it mostly positive or is it mostly negative or neutral? Token classification, which can be very interesting, where each word or token you would give a label, like to identify this is for a brand, this is a person, this is a place, and how you can fine tune that on your own data. Also things like spelling correction, which can be very powerful UX in applications, especially in search. And then further down the line, going to look at vision problems also, since vision transformers are very powerful and you can have then multimodal, where you've got text and images and perhaps other data too. So I'm going to explore this over time and would absolutely welcome all collaboration, questions, feedback. Thank you.